We're really excited today to really dig into selecting standards and building progressions for mastery learning. We have, this is a really big foundation block in teaching students the language of learning and the language of standards, as well as helping them really be able to articulate what they know and can do, know where they are on the progression, how close they are to mastery, and also help them provide better specific feedback to students, peer students. I mean, the better they have. It's telling me to reload the page. Should I reload the page? Let's see.
I don't know. I can see you, so it feels like it's working.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be the YouTube part that's not working. I don't know.
Yeah.
So we think it's so important that after you've set up the routines and rituals and you've had the ongoing conversations about the grading mindset and how that's going to shift in your learning space, just quick recap from the last couple of weeks, the next major thing you need to do is select the standards, which you'll have done before you introduce that to students, obviously. Really thinking about what your grade level standards look like, what 2 years of grade level standards look like on those standards for your particular class, and 2 years after. And if you're a high school senior teacher and the graduation is your end results, you might still think about that as a terminus for mastery, as that highest level of graduation requirement. And then you could start looking at other sets of standards that maybe go to the collegiate level to sort of expand a little bit more on giving nuance for your higher level kids. So we're going to throw it to Isaac first today, because he works with our earliest learners, and I work at the totally other end of the spectrum with the oldest learners in the K-12 situation. So how does a teacher select, Isaac, which standards to really focus on in kinder and first grade? And then how do you build those progressions out?
Yeah, the good news in a way is it's essentially exactly the same as we do in 12th grade, which is we want to look at how important is this skill to other work and learning that they're going to have to do within this year and across years. We want to make sure, like you said, that it's related to their college and career readiness, and that it's transferable, that it's really going to work across, like I said, across grades, but also across subjects. So in K1, I've had the privilege to work with some amazing teachers from Mammoth, Lake Washington, Spartanburg District 2, a bunch of our great people from District 31 in come on, brain, Staten Island. Wow.
Yeah.
And some others that I'm accidentally leaving out. But the K1 teachers, part of why they do such an unbelievable job with this is in some ways those progressions are a bit more clear, because we're often even starting with what looks like nothing to, the untrained eye. Like, they can't read, they can't write, they can't problem solve in K. Well, yes, they can. They just can't do it the way we mean yet. And so when we focus on those skills, I was working with Holly McMurray, a good friend of mine, a great colleague, and we were really saying, okay, what is most essential, but will also be practiced throughout the year? So we started at the basics, phonemic awareness. And if you're a high school person, what that essentially means is being able to identify and manipulate sounds in words. So, the traditional cat blending, or cat, separating it out. As simple as that is, that sets the foundation for all we do in reading and writing. So in that way, that would be at the beginning of a unit, maybe if we're looking at 4, 6, 9 weeks. But similarly, if we think about something like writing, if you've had a young child, which I know Starr and I both have, their early drawings are just things. But then when they start to draw,
works of art, Isaac. Works of art.
They're beautiful because they've got the heart in them. But when they start to draw particular people and scenes, we usually get those mandala figures where you've got kind of the snow person, which is the one snow, and then the little arms and legs coming out, maybe a face on that. Well, we can take that and grow it into a writing progression. And I'm going to throw in the in the comments section right now a link to a Sarah Rube video, which I know we've shared in the past. And that's an excellent example of how a group of teachers worked first just by themselves, but then later with kids to focus on what's most important. And in writing, we need people to be able to take in your message. So that means we've got to clearly shape those letters or clearly shape those people and places in our drawings. We have to have a clear point that we want to get across. So we've got to focus. And so you'll see in that all that happening in what looks like a very simple level. But then if you listen in to Sarah as the girl talking in this video, you really hear that thinking we want. Like last night, I know we had Katie Smith on a TCC Masterclass webinar, and she talked a lot about inquiry and how our best evidence is what kids say about their own learning. And the progression not only brings that out, but it gives them context to talk about learning's this big, but in the progression, I'm somewhere in here.
So as we get further along and we get to the middle school, high school, secondary element, the standards obviously become progressively more complex.
Yes.
There are multiple parts to them. And sometimes the foundational standard doesn't seem like it's that big, but then when you go down into what the state's teaching recommendations are around a particular standard, and we did experience this with Spartanburg when we were unpacking the new social studies standards, sometimes the standard itself is pretty vague, but then the teaching implications are the thing that kind of give you the big ideas and the essential questions that you're going to be putting together. And TCC really does have a great unpacking tool that is from the Impact Team book that Paul Bloomberg and Barb Pitchford wrote, which is a great template for breaking down these core standards. When we were using the Common Core, they actually had foundational standards separated, and then it went in, 2-year grade bands. When you got it, there was a 6th grade, a 7th grade, and 8th grade, and then 9, 10, 11, 12. And when I was thinking about what my class was going to really be focusing on, and I know Jamie has really mentioned this a few times about how do you know which standards to pick. I always think about my curriculum and the stuff that I need students to be able to know and can do, but be able to articulate those specific things by the end of the year. I try to pick key ones out. A bunch of them are really going to be touched upon, but maybe not as deeply. And when I was working with the AP class, the AP standards are actually in a binder, and it's enormous, and it's on a 6-level scale instead of, just the standard itself, not really broken down. And when we build these progressions, the things that are different about them is that you're not putting it in like a 4, 3, 2, 1 mastery proficient, not there yet. What you're really looking at is the standard itself is what proficient for that grade band is. And the state expects that your students are able to do that by the end of the school year at that grade level for them to be proficient. And when we think about what happens on the mastery side of that, if I'm teaching a 7th grade student who's already functioning at the end of what the 8th grade progression is, that's a student who's established mastery for the 7th grade standards because they are well above what is going on. They've mastered the 7th grade standards, are now proficient in the 8th grade standards. So if we build out these progressions for thinking about, like, I know the big ones for me were, if I was doing informational texts, they needed to be able to understand text structures. They needed to be able to talk about author's craft and the different ways that authors create meaning. They needed to be able to write about those things as well in depth. And then getting more deeper, especially in the AP classes, thinking about literary devices and literary structures, bringing genre into that as well. Even though the reading and writing are separate in the standards, they're inextricably linked when we think about how we're assessing kids, especially at the secondary level, because a lot of times you're going to be assessing students' understanding of reading based on their writing. So those two things are going to go together completely. And when you're building those progressions and you're thinking about the complexity, part of what looking at the earlier standards and the later standards going to do is you're going to notice, first of all, where the overlap is. It's the core of that standard. And then what are the nuanced differences between a 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade standard? Sometimes it's as simple as adding dialogue in a narrative. If you're looking at a narrative standard, that's a major difference from 7th to 8th grade. Whereas just understanding the narrative structure is what's important in 6th grade. So we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the author's craft. And then the higher up you go, the more so that gets. Something that kind of always irritated me as an 11th and 12th grade English teacher was that students got taught simile, metaphor, and personification as soon as they could start understanding what literary devices were. And those were the same literary devices that were continually taught every single year. And I don't think it's a bad thing for us to cycle through things and spiral. So we're hearing the same terms, but we got to be adding new ones every single year so that if they are going to take an AP class in 11th or 12th grade, they do have a lot more depth of understanding of those different devices. And although the standard itself doesn't really spell that out for you, it's important for you to also understand that your curriculum has to line up with those standards, and what you're actually teaching kids is deeply progressing along the way. Science and math and social studies have very different content needs every single year. So those content needs drive a lot of the standards year to year, which is a very different thing than literacy that stays consistent the whole time and just continues to build up. And even if you're a social studies, science, or math teacher, you still have literacy skills you need to cover. And the Common Core did a really nice job of making sure that literacy in other content areas was definitely in there as well, so that different content area teachers were also building those literacy skills.
That's kind of what I'm hearing you say, is that as we prioritize standards, we're looking at that grade level standard. We're looking at it in context with the surrounding standards in the grade level, but also we really have to have a deep knowledge of what it means, like where it came from and where it's headed. And as you said, that is more complicated in science, social studies, math, and other areas. And I just shared a quick link to Achieve the Core, their coherence map project, which I'm sure many of you have used before. And if you use Common Core or something similar, which most state standards now are very similar to those, it can help you map all those connections. Where did this come from? Where is this going in mathematics? Which, as you said, is not nearly as straightforward.
There's so many more standards in math content-wise which is why I know a lot of math teachers get very overwhelmed with the standards-based idea of assessing, because it really does drill down to very different skills. And one of our colleagues at TCC, Lori Cook, does a really great job of focusing math progressions around math practices. And the content is added to that, but she's thinking more in terms of math skills that transcend all the content that kind of happens.
That's a great point. And I did share 2 very quick videos of a first grader who's using a progression about problem solving and sharing his thinking, and Starr is smiling because it's a very cute one. And it'll blow you away the first time you see it. You think, wow, could I have talked like that even in 8th, 9th, 10th grade about my thinking and my development as a problem solver? Well, probably no, because you probably didn't work with your class and your teacher to co-construct a progression. and then save some work samples to reflect back on. So, that part ties into it too. Seeing my own work over time brings that progression of life for me.
I think also too that sometimes we think that curriculum is set in stone, but it's really a living, breathing document when you have a curriculum map. It's supposed to help you stay on focus. And if you're really thinking in terms of having equity in all the spaces at the same grade level, that every single teacher is teaching the same content, that doesn't mean you have to teach it the same way. And it doesn't mean you have to necessarily teach it at the same pace because you have different kids in your space. But there is a certain amount of content that must be taught by the end of the school year so that each one of those kids who have passed through 6th grade, 7th grade, 4th grade, 3rd graders going into the next teacher's class with the same body of learning. And we do acknowledge, of course, that kids are human beings and they learn at different paces. So you are going to have kids who aren't going to come in at grade level, even if they did get the same content the year before. And you are going to have kids who started ahead and also end ahead because that's just the way that it is. Some students pick things up more quickly. Some kids are more developmentally ahead at different times. And as they're growing and learning, they certainly develop these different things as, these different skill sets as they move forward. And as teachers, I had mentioned last time, putting the standards in kid-friendly language and making sure that that's what hangs in a room. The next step to that is to build progressions with your students. If these are the standards we're working on, and we've decided that this is what mastery looks like for that standard, how do you know that you've met that standard? How do you know that you have mastered it? What does that look like? And that's how you would start to build out these progressions, thinking about the first step before you get there as an emergent sort of learner on that standard, moving toward proficiency and hopefully mastery by the end of the school year. And you won't get through every standard on your grade level every year, at least not in depth, but the core of the major standards that you decide that you're going to work on, and you could choose those. And this is something that I would have railed against myself 5, 6 years ago, thinking about how the state assesses at the end of a year, which are the key standards they are focusing on. I am in no way advocating that you teach through a test. I want to be very clear about that. What I am advocating for is that there is a skill set that those exams are looking to assess. And if you really deconstruct those exams and look at the ones that have the highest frequency in terms of skill set, then that could also be a way to help you narrow down which ones you put your focus toward. Never tell students that you are choosing these standards because it's how they're going to do best on a test. These are the standards that are going to help them be successful in life. And hopefully your state exams are aligned with your own ideals about what that looks like, as well as your school system's idea with the curriculum.
And I do think, though we know standardized testing is not an effective way to really measure progress in learning or to measure our effectiveness. But what I will say is well-intentioned educational experts determine what will be on those. And so I think there's a lot to be said for what do they focus on. Now, of course, one limit to that is some of our standards are very difficult or maybe impossible to assess on a standardized test. And so those may be missing even when they are a priority. But yeah, I think you're right. And to some extent, to be honest with the kids and say, like, this is a part of school. There's certain things we have to be able to do to move to the next level. It's funny because right when you started really talking about that kind of prereq and advanced idea, Matt had put in here, I'm going to just quote him, standards simply require context, mainly through looking at that scope and sequence to be meaningful. And then that next level is sharing it with the students so they can control the learning and in terms they understand. And as you talked about those skills that are prioritized, it made me think back to what you were talking about a bit earlier, where the standards have so many things that are not clear. that
Yes.
that as an educator, the kids have to master this to do it. And Paul Bloomberg and I have had a lot of time these last few weeks to work together on some curriculum work and things. And it's been interesting that the focus on concepts has grown every time we talk. And so one just quick resource I wanted to share, and I know there's other great things like this, but is literaryterms.net. Hey, Huxley, we were talking about you. But literaryterms.net is a great quick reference, and I'll throw it in the chat, to really expand those concepts. And it's student friendly to a point. I wouldn't be using it in first, second grade, but pretty much if it's a term that your standards imply, but they don't say, then that grade level student can probably understand it with maybe a little support. And I wondered if you had any ideas of other places like that where we can kind of stop and check in on those concepts. I'm even thinking of the oh my gosh, the science inquiry by design stuff that I just lost the real name for, but they have such great, I'll think for a minute and I'll come back to that.
So, I mean, I think that that's also really important. And thanks, Matt,
Mm-hmm.
for sharing that you guys have been really working hard to
Mm-hmm.
make them more approachable. Because if we want students to be able to reflect on their learning based on the content,
Mm-hmm.
we can't just mention a standard at some point and then never come back to it.
Oh, right.
It should be embedded in the way that we teach every day. The language should be pervasive in the conversations that we're having. It should be in the learning target. It should be a discussion as a part of the work period in your workshops. The language needs to be around. And even when you're building your assignment sheets or your projects, they need to be directly aligned so that the success criteria also speaks to that language, so that if you're going to ask kids to reflect, they have this progression standard language where they could identify themselves on the progression, speak to where in their learning actually shows what evidence they have that shows that that's where they are on the progression. And then they have that support there as well as the vocabulary. And New York State, and I'm sure a lot of other states right now, are probably rethinking standards in a lot of different content areas. And most recently, they've done the Next Gen Learning Standards for English in New York, where they've taken the Common Core and they've really condensed it. They tried to make the language more clear, a little less ambiguous. There are still words like effective or sophisticated. I think those are all very problematic words because they're so subjective. And unless a state is going to be providing examples of what those things actually look like, that could be deconstructed by teachers and shared with students. Any language that's vague like that, that leaves so much open to interpretation. It's the responsibility of a teacher and the teacher team around a grade level inside of a school to have that vertical articulation where as a group you decide how you're going to teach what effective looks like, how you're going to teach what sophisticated is and how that is different than effective. Or precise is another one they like to throw around when it comes to language in particular. Precision, sophisticated, these are all great words, but I'm not really sure it defines what kids know and can do in a way that they will be able to identify unless we make it really clear for them when we're doing that in class, and we give them really good exemplars. We show them models. We really let them even look at the model and identify with the progression. Where do you think this one is on the progression? Don't only give them ones that are mastery. Give them ones that fit different aspects of the progression in different spaces. Maybe it's got a great introduction and it has a really strong thesis statement. So students are really able to have that strong organizational piece, but maybe it lacks depth. So to even decide where each of those pieces go as you're breaking it down for students, that they really do get an understanding of what those expectations are. So
that really made me think about a video you mentioned this morning when we were chatting of the fifth grade boys out in the hall with their learning progression, because not only do they have examples that show at proficient, above, and below, but they're talking through an example that's working towards proficiency, but is not quite there yet. So I'm going to share a quick link to that. But it's a
so
great
good.
one. Yeah. And
I
it's
mean,
so much fun for
honestly,
kids to watch it of any ages, younger or older. They can get the idea from it and hear how they use all those things you said, using that precise vocabulary that they understand, comparing to examples. But yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up.
yeah, and I hope you do take the time to watch it, because I think one thing I struggled with high school teachers when I was in a leadership role, and even when I was a high school teacher with other high school teachers, there's a lot of students can't thinking, that they lack the sophistication to have the kind of conversations that we want them to be having. And really, when you see how some of these kindergartners talk about learning when they're talking about success criteria, these fifth grade students, how they're able to really articulate what they know and can do and give really precise feedback based on those progressions, you have to say to yourself, how do I make this happen in my secondary spaces too? And if you have students who are fortunate enough to have been in a system where at the elementary level they're already able to articulate these things, then we do them a disservice at the secondary level if we stop including them in those decisions, stop including them in giving them the opportunity to show what they know in a number of different ways, and also empower peers to work together to offset some of the load from us in giving that feedback. So Isaac, if we're going to wrap up right now, we're coming up on the half-hour mark. What do you think the takeaways need to be? Where do teachers start if they're building progressions or co-constructing them with students? What's the first thing they can do?
I think the first thing we do on our end is that we get together with someone, at least a partner. I had a friend, a mentor of mine, that would always say, the mind is like a dark alley. You can go there, but you should never go there alone. And so we took that phrase and would apply it to all these other things we did together as coaches. And I would say curriculum is like that, because you can spend 6 hours by yourself digging in and researching, or you can spend 25 minutes having a good conversation with 2 or 3 of your colleagues, and using our Unpacking for Success protocol or those resources we shared that Starr mentioned. So I think first is that we need to have a solid understanding of it so we determine which standards to focus on. But then I think as soon as that is done, it's time to bring the kids in. And whether we have an exemplar we share and get them to analyze with us, or we get them to create some drafts and we kind of compare those and we start to co-construct those success criteria, I've found that the best progressions include student work, which may start with teacher work or like student work that we create ahead until we can replace it. But because the kids really determine what works. And I was inspired, I've mentioned Paul Bloomberg a couple times, but from a story he shared with me. And so I showed up at a school and we were doing some of this work. And we said, well, okay, how about at lunch break, if you guys determine which kids you want to bring in from the kindergarten class and from the first grade class, and we'll just try this. It may not go great because I'm a funny looking dude. They don't know. And I will say every time I've ever done it in my own class, towards the end of my teaching career or in others' classes, the kids take over and do so much more than we expect. Because I will admit our first expectations were a bit low. Let's see if they can notice 1 or 2 criteria. But we handed it over to them and said, okay, where would this go? Now, we did have a few examples up. So now I'm getting into this story. But I would say, yeah, the takeaways are we need to understand what these standards really mean and entail, what skills and concepts are hidden in those standards that you have to be an expert science teacher or social studies teacher or whatever to know. Do that with your colleagues. and then bring the kids in right away, because it's a work in progress. We don't have to get it exactly right the first time, because it's a bit of a scientific approach. And then I would say gather evidence, video those discussions if you're on Zoom right now, or if they're scanning in and texting you, writing samples or fluent reading samples or whatever they're doing, and save them. Because just like in that first grade example we shared earlier, a huge part of that power comes when you're able to look back and say, wait a minute, that's what we used to do. And can I share one more anecdote?
Sure.
I know I just talked a whole lot, but my wife is a third grade teacher now, but has taught for, I don't know, a long time, fifth grade, fourth grade, third grade, and been a coach. But when she was teaching fifth grade one time, and I was a coach in the same school, we were coming down the hall and there was like yelling coming from her room. And she's very open and the kids have a lot of control, but she's also, right on them. So I thought, man, what is happening? But I was taking care of something else. So I didn't know till later. She had a girl who was so upset because someone had put her name on her work and it wasn't her work. Now, of course, it was that girl's work from a few months before, but she had grown so much in her writing ability to like write to respond that she could not fathom that was her work. It came out of her writing folder, had her name on it. And so like on the one hand, that was uncomfortable when it happened and then hilarious, but it's a beautiful moment because eventually the girl accepted like, oh, that was my work. But in a few short months, she had changed that much.
And that speaks to the power of portfolio too. If we are constantly collecting the work, not just documenting everything, but collecting everything as we go, then what we could really do is take the best pieces of everything all along the way, tracking the actual progression of student work to really line up with the progression. You started out over here, and now you're over here, and you can actually see the growth. So, I mean, if you could think about that for a second, and then imagine what a reflection would look like when we're finishing those end of year portfolios and students actually see what they were doing in September and October, and then what they're able to do in May and June. There's nothing better than actually having that comparison visible when you're having that conversation with kids and you're asking them to use that language and talk about the strengths they've developed over time and new goals they're setting because of where they are right now. And I think that it's so, so, so important that we tell kids they can. And it doesn't matter where you start as long as you keep on growing on the progression, which is why we have to, I think there's something extraordinarily impactful about showing students progressions because they could visually see the start and end points. And it's not just a letter grade right in the middle that just ends with whatever you give it. Here's an opportunity to identify different parts of their learning that they're already strong at in some areas that they still need to work on, but it's a that everybody kind of takes that away. We're really excited about next week as well. This topic's going to be all about giving effective feedback. So if you have specific questions about effective feedback, drop them on the calendar that we have, and then we'll make sure to address them. If you have any kind of resources you'd like to add to that document, please do that as well. And again, thank you for a great week. I'm wondering now too, and maybe we'll put this out on the group page, is this time no longer good because people have gone back to school? Is it time for us to rethink when we're doing this, or is it okay because you're getting to watch the videos after the fact? It doesn't really matter when we do it. So let us know what you think. Have a great weekend, everybody.